the News Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here on a Monday. Hope you had a good weekend. Back at it today. We've got a good show on tap for you. This is something that we've been meaning to do for a while. I've been following the news. Of course, you know about some of the mass shootings, of course, that have occurred, you know, in different settings. A lot of them happening at schools and elsewhere. And recently, in the aftermath of this, as we've reported over the last week and a half, there have been some suicides involved in that as well. As you probably saw, two students who had survived some of these school shootings have taken their lives, and then a parent has as well. It's part of the larger question, and if you watched 60 Minutes last night, there was a great first segment on 60 Minutes addressing the issue of the aftermath of some of these mass shootings. And of course, it's horrible for those who are injured or obviously lose their lives in those situations. But then the family members, those who did survive, and how do they move forward? And sometimes you don't hear about that as much, and it can be devastating. And even if it hasn't happened to you, if you see it in the news media, I think it can be a concern for anyone wherever you live. Maybe your child seeing it on the news and wondering, could that happen to me at school? Or parents worried all the time about the safety of their kids or themselves. We're going to get into that this morning with our guest. We can take some phone calls, questions from you as you've been following the news. But she is a licensed psychologist, Dr. Anna Settle. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Nice to have you on. So, I mean, it's all awful. Okay, you see this, you do this. First of all, as a licensed psychologist, you have a private practice, but you also go into prisons as well?
Yes.
Okay, and so you deal with these kind of issues?
Yes, absolutely.
Folks seeing shootings. All right, so the mass shootings are scary. We all see that in the news. We have to cover it. Of late, and I thought we'd start with this because it's the most recent thing that people are talking about, we've seen suicides.
Right.
Before the show, though, we were talking about it, and my concern is that, you know, one starts, and there's a second, a third. This can take on where people end up copycatting?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, having someone that you know complete a suicide is certainly a predictive factor of your risk for completing suicide.
Because maybe these people were contemplating or feeling the depression after the fact anyway?
Sure, yes. So they see that someone else has been provided relief by completing suicide, and then also, as we were talking about, the media sometimes sensationalizes the act of the suicide, or even the schools unintentionally talk about it and sensationalize it, and
right.
So then the peers of the person who completed suicide start thinking about that as an option.
All right, so I'm curious your take. You're watching the news, and just from where you come from, and you work with families and people that are dealing with this kind of anxiety, but when you see us report that a student that survived one of these shootings claimed her own life, and it's not just us, it's the media as a whole. Right. Do you think, well, gee, I wish they hadn't reported that? Because typically, I'll say, as many of you know, we don't report suicides as a rule unless it's attached to a larger story. Obviously, if someone who's a very public figure claims their life, we would have to report that because that affects things, all right?
Right.
And this was attached. What do you think when we report that these students commit suicide?
So I think it's important to talk about it, absolutely. So I think the reporting of the suicide is not where we go wrong. I think it's more sensationalizing it and talking, being very descriptive about the method that was used.
Okay.
So especially for younger adolescents and children, when they hear the media talk about the way that the suicide was completed, that actually makes them at higher risk for completing suicide as well.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
more detail.
All right, so maybe that's a reason. So there's a way where you talk about someone taking their life, but maybe don't go into more of those details,
Right.
which I think there's no need to necessarily.
Right.
Do you have to describe why or how they, rather how they killed themselves? Let's talk about the why, though. What do you imagine was the situation with these students? One of the mothers was saying that she had survivor's guilt,
right,
and that she also was in a situation where she was fearful just going to class. She
right.
couldn't do that. She was tormented. Now, you would think that she was afraid of it happening again and dying, and yet she chose to take her own life.
Right. So here's the deal. When these shootings happen, we inundate the students in the schools with mental health professionals.
Okay.
But PTSD, it might take 3 months to show up, sometimes even 6 months to show up. And so in the beginning, we provide all of this support. And then within a couple of weeks, I think with one of the last shootings, it was 2 weeks. The students were back in school. They were expected to go back through that routine. And when you think about trauma, most of the time you don't have to re-enter a situation where a trauma occurred. They're walking right back into these classrooms. So they're re-traumatized each day. And if they don't have support through that beyond 2 weeks, then of course we're going to see symptoms of PTSD.
So is there something to be said for getting back to normalcy? I mean, are they going back too quickly, or how do you decide? And I would imagine it varies from student to student.
Right. Normalcy is important. So getting back into the routine is necessary.
Right.
The other piece of it, though, is that you have to have continued support as they're going through that process. So I think 2 weeks we provide support, and then it's kind of like, oh, get back to the way things were. It's not enough.
Yeah, this student, one of the two, I mean, it had been almost a year, I suppose, and she had been involved in some of the activities there, trying to raise awareness and the issues. Is that then the responsibility of the parents if they think that she's functioning okay, but they can hide the feelings?
Right. Yeah. I mean, even one of the women who completed suicide, there was a Facebook post, and she mentioned something about, you know, check on the people, even the strongest people.
Right.
So it was sort of a little bit of a cryptic post where you're like, oh, okay, I wonder if she's talking about herself. I think there are signs no matter what. Even if somebody is functioning and doing well, you're going to see something that shows that there's some depression going on.
All right, and so obviously the parents in all these cases are like, oh my gosh, what did we miss, or why did we not do it? So are you saying then that the parents need to continue with treatment well beyond just the 3 weeks?
Yes.
And what are you suggesting then, that they arrange through a private counselor to have the student who may not want to go?
Right.
Right?
Right, yeah, and just to continue asking the question, are you okay, what do you need? The other piece of this is there's no one to blame, right? So you can provide all the support that you can have that continued treatment, and then somebody still can complete suicide. They're just in so much distress that just seems like a better option. So I don't want to place blame on people, parents, administrators, because even with treatment, sometimes the depression is just too great.
Okay, so suicide is the most extreme result of that, unfortunately, but there's a lot of them that will just go through the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma of what they went through. So
right.
I imagine you never get over it, but there has to be a way you can learn to live with it.
Yes.
And I'm not just talking then about those folks, but even folks that haven't experienced it but witness it through the news, and that's unsettling to them because all of a sudden they're afraid it could happen at their school.
Yes, and PTSD, you can have that through viewing media. So we saw that a lot with 9/11. People were watching, and then they were actually having symptoms of PTSD and having to go to treatment because of what they saw through the media. They weren't even in the area when it happened.
If you would, just I think most people have heard PTSD. Give it the definition of what post-traumatic stress disorder is, and we hear it usually with association with soldiers coming back from overseas that they've been in combat.
Right.
But
so
what is it?
People most often think it's veterans, but it happens anytime you are exposed to a trauma where you fear for your own life or for someone else's, then you can start to develop those symptoms.
Doesn't mean you will. Some people maybe for whatever reason process it differently.
Right.
But you could, right?
Right, yeah. Some people are predisposed because of biological factors or because of past trauma. But what it looks like is the person starts re-experiencing whatever the trauma was. So that can be flashbacks, it can be nightmares. They tend to be super hypervigilant. So you might be sitting in a classroom for a student who's experiencing PTSD, and then someone shuts a door and they turn around really quickly, and they're just very startled. And you see symptoms of depression. You see them. There's sort of a numbness and a helplessness and a hopelessness that shows up. So that's what it looks like.
Now, is that treated through counseling? Now, you're as a psychologist, you don't prescribe medicine.
Correct.
You're not a psychiatrist.
That's right.
Okay, so what is the treatment then for that? I guess you talked about the counseling and how these parents need to make sure the kids continue to talk about it, I guess. But what do medicines come into play?
They can. Yeah. I mean,
antidepressants?
Sure, absolutely. Especially if you're doing that in conjunction with therapy, that's what's most effective. But some students and some people who have experienced trauma don't need medication, so they can go through. We just walk through the trauma. You can do EMDR, which is a type of therapy that is aimed at targeting the symptoms of PTSD.
Yeah.
But it's a long process. You re-walk through the trauma. You talk about the details of it. You make sure that they feel safe, that they understand the nuances of it, and they also understand that it wasn't their fault, that they couldn't control it.
Yeah, and that takes time. It was interesting in that 60 Minutes piece, as we go to the break last night, they were talking to one mother of a daughter that had been killed in one of these mass shootings. And initially her friends were trying to work with her, and it took months, and finally, I don't know, it was like 6 or 7 months, she said in the piece last night, that she just broke down and started crying. It finally got out, and she was, I don't know why. I mean, she wanted it to come out, but finally it just surfaced months later. And then after that happened is where the recovery started. Right,
yeah. So when you're exposed to trauma, you go into that fight or flight mode. And so there's a biological component to it. And so if somebody just gets walled up because they're protecting themselves from something that's dangerous, that can last for quite some time.
Dang. All right, it's complex stuff. Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, we've got some phone calls coming in. 737-7587. It's a broad topic. We can talk more about that and maybe how you deal with some of these issues with some of your patients. If they come in having just seen it in the media, like you said, you can get PTSD from watching it. I guess everyone's different. We'll take a break. Be back with your calls as we continue our conversation this morning. Aftermath of mass shootings, mental health, and suicide prevention. We'll get into that right after this.